Story 1. Back in high school, our geography class was assigned projects on a specific country. The student assigned Austria accidentally did his project on Australia and really nailed it, making it funny, interesting, and informative. The student who was actually assigned Australia did a poor job and probably cried after class. Story 2. I once asked a Sunday school teacher what the meat eaters on Noah's Ark ate. She said, unicorns and dinosaurs. Story 3. My then teenage brother-in-law, when asked the trivia question, what is xenophobia, replied that it was fear of the warrior princess. We gave him the point. Story 4. The teacher asked, does anyone know what yeast is? The correct answer was fungus. A completely serious student answered, an infection. The teacher belly laughed and immediately composed herself. Story 5. I work with two identical twin brothers. The other day a customer came in, looked at both of them and asked, are you guys related? My coworker said, yeah, I'm his mom. Story 6. My roommate asked, what is the Second Amendment? Is it thou shalt not kill? Story 7. My trivia team got the question, what word is a nationality but, when spelled the same and pronounced differently, means to make smooth? We knew the right answer, Polish, but my team captain also thought of Brazilian. Story 8. I once asked my younger cousin what the capital of Italy was, and he said, pizza. I swear I couldn't even correct him because he looked so confident. Story 9. From Family Feud. Question. Name an animal with 3 letters in its name. Answer, alligator. Story 10. Alcohol kills germs as a defense of drinking while sick. Story 11. A year 6 child in the UK was in a sex education class, and I was there as a teacher trainee observing. We had a little quiz at the beginning to see what they already knew. The question was, what is the average volume of male ejaculate? Children's guesses included 2 pints. I, barely keeping it together, said, change that unit, kiddo. One child replied, 2 liters. I was removed from the class for laughing too hard. Story 12. Original Hollywood Squares. Host. According to the food editor of the Dallas Morning News, what is the best reason for pounding meat? Paul Lind. Oh, loneliness. Story 13. I used to work as a university writing tutor. While reviewing one student's history paper, I had to explain that no, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini did not start World War I because they disagreed with Martin Luther King Jr.'s stance on the civil rights movement. Yes, I checked, he meant the First World War, not the Second. I knew it was going to be bad when we first sat down. The students said they had not been paying attention in class and asked what fascism was, explaining that the professor keeps talking about it. Story 14. Liverpool radio quiz legend. What was Hitler's first name? Heil. Story 15. One time I overheard a customer ask a colleague what simple mail transfer protocol meant in our software settings, and my colleague confidently replied that it stood for send mail to people. It makes so much sense that it has completely replaced the official meaning in my head. Story 16. Our music teacher asked us what a dominant seventh was. A lad in the class answered that it was a stern mistress. Story 17. One of my favorite things is teasing children by asking what sound different animals make. Once I asked a friend's 3-year-old what sounds various animals make. I threw her a curveball and asked, what sound does a pumpkin make? She shouted, boo! And I couldn't stop laughing. Finally I asked, what sound does a giraffe make? She replied with a little song like something from a music box. I asked where she heard it, and she said, that's the sound my stuffed giraffe makes. It was too adorable. Story 18. The best wrong answer I've ever heard was from my 5-year-old daughter. My wife said, I hope she meets a nice guy like you someday. My daughter said, no, I'm going to meet a handsome guy. I laughed while dying inside. Story 19. A favorite story from college. In a comparative religions class discussing the Crusades, the professor introduced the guest lecturer for the week as one of the world's foremost experts on the Crusades. The guest lecturer began an overview of that week's topics and gave a broad recap that the Crusades were not a clear victory for Europeans. But history is often presented from a European perspective. A student in the row in front of us leaned over to his friend and said, this guy is wrong. The English won the Crusades. I saw the Disney movie. He seemed serious and sincere in his belief that the Robin Hood tale, with talking foxes, tigers, and snakes, was 100% historically accurate. Story 20. I taught a children's karate class several years ago, and one moment still stays with me. While I was demonstrating a back kick, I asked who could tell me what the kick was called. A 4-year-old girl replied that sometimes when mom and dad have fun by themselves, that's when a baby comes out. Story 21. On Reddit, a woman argued with me that she worked in healthcare and knew for a fact that the only place a fertilized egg could implant was the uterus. May the heavens watch over her patience. Story 22. When I was in 6th grade, we were learning basic earth science. My teacher mentioned Letchworth State Park in New York as a good example of a river gorge and called it the Grand Canyon of the East. A classmate promptly raised his hand and asked what the Grand Canyon of the West was. Story 23. What's the proper name for Lou Gehrig's disease? Lou Gehrig's disease. Story 24. Burps are the ghosts of the animals you have eaten, leaving your body. Story 25. My grandson, who was 5 at the time, came home from school and told me he had been learning about shapes. A hexagon has 6 sides, he said. Wow, I said. How many sides has an octagon? I don't know, he replied. 8 sides, I said. He paused, then asked, how many sides does a Mexican have? Story 26. Someone once said the sun goes around the earth, and they argued it for a solid 5 minutes. Legendary confidence in a completely wrong answer. Story 27. In my college literature class, one student asked what color hazel is. Another suggested green. A third insisted it is brown like hazelnuts. The others agreed. Story 28. On a high school biology test, we had an extra credit question. What is the only mammal that cannot jump? A classmate of mine answered, a paraplegic. He did not get credit for it. Story 29. I once argued with 5 people one night that there are 50 states in the United States, not 52. They said, yes, but what about Alaska and Hawaii? I replied, yes, there were 48 states and now there are 50. This was in the pre-internet days, so I couldn't just look it up online and prove it. No one would believe me, and I actually started to doubt myself. Story 30. A contestant on Family Fortunes was asked to name a type of ache. He could have said backache, headache, or heartache, but he answered a fillet of fish because he thought they had asked for a type of hake. Story 31. In the ass? Where is the strangest place you and your partner have made whoopee? The Newlywed Game. Story 32. Ken Jennings answered, what is a hoe? With a long-handled gardening tool that can also mean an immoral pleasure seeker. The correct answer was a rake, but Jennings isn't technically wrong. Story 33. Not a wrong answer, but a funny one. We were at a barbecue and someone said to my child that they should become a cop. My child said, no way, I would just end up shooting someone. The same person replied, I didn't say you had to be a good cop. Story 34. What was the disease that caused the Irish potato famine? The British. Story 35. A little kid was asked, what is the capital of France? And they confidently said, F. Technically not wrong, but absolutely not right either. Story 36. I went to a pawn shop to pawn some jewelry. One ring was copper-plated gold. He told me it was magnetic. What a fool. Story 37. My ex-partner and I argued about when it is safe to cross the street. I said to start crossing when the walk signal appears. He said to wait until the red hand begins to blink with the countdown timer. He was not very bright, and I was not sure whether he was trying to kill me. Story 38. One 4th of July, I was with 2 children watching the fireworks. A few seconds after the show ended, when a lot of residual smoke still hung in the air, and there was a brief pause in sound, one of the children pointed to the sky and confidently said, oh look, Mom, that's how clouds are made. A smattering of laughter followed for a few minutes. Story 39. The question was, is a moose a kind of lion? The answer was no, it's a bird. None of them were from North America, but I still wouldn't want a moose bird to defecate on my car. I never got over that answer. At least the guy asking didn't know it all, while the other was so confident. Story 40. Teacher. Name an example of mismanagement. Student. A pregnant prostitute. Story 41. An analogy is like a thought with another thought's hat on. Britta Perry. Story 42. This was from my quiz bowl days. I confused Orson Welles and Herbert George Wells, and my mouth fused the two into Orgy Wells. Story 43. My unemployed girlfriend told me she wants to get 6 separate 8-hour jobs with overtime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for all 36 hours in a day. My brain cells have never recovered, and neither has my heart. Story 44. Maybe not the best, but one of the most memorable. We were studying the 50 states in 4th grade and had to learn each state's name and its location on a big unlabeled map. During a review before the big test, the teacher would point to a state and ask a random student to name it, giving hints as needed. She pointed to Iowa. The student selected to answer did not know it. The teacher gave the hint. It has been in the news a lot lately, because the Iowa caucuses were underway for the election season. The student paused for a moment, then said, Cambodia? The teacher looked like she had died inside. Story 45. Not the best, but it is strange how often a technician will answer a question I did not ask. Today, for example, a technician said he needed a quote on a brake light bulb. The catalog shows 2 bulbs in each lamp. One is a dual filament brake and turn signal bulb, and the other is brake only. One is high in the lamp and one is low. I asked whether the top or bottom bulb. The technician confidently said the passenger side. That may be correct, but it did not answer my question. This happens all the time. When I ask driver or passenger, the reply is front. I then have to clarify, front driver or front passenger. Story 46. Hey Shane. Who won the American Civil War? I don't know. Mel Gibson. Story 47. I just Googled how to be approachable to dogs, and artificial intelligence said I should be sure the dog's tail is wagging when I approach. Key factors influencing a dog's trust. Positive body language. Dogs are masters at reading body language. A relaxed, open posture, a calm expression, and a wagging tail are signs that a person is friendly and non-threatening. Story 48. I was at a bus stop. There was a lady with her son, maybe 4 years old. He pointed at a pigeon and said, Look, Mom, a pigeon. She replied, That's not a pigeon, it's a bird. Story 49. When my professor showed a picture of Jim Morrison during a lecture about the creative mind, she asked the class if anyone knew who he was. A girl in the back of the class raised her hand very confidently and said Charles Manson. Story 50. When I was in middle school, we did a brain teaser in English class. We had to find a fruit or vegetable for every letter of the alphabet. No one could think of a word for D except one classmate. That classmate, with unmatched confidence, raised their hand and answered, Dingleberry. Story 51. In 8th grade, we had a bonus question on one of our tests. What are you going to wear to the cowboy-themed assembly on Friday? I was in a mood, so I answered, my birthday suit. I was the only person who did not get the bonus question right. Story 52. On an episode of Family Fortunes, the United Kingdom version of Family Feud, the question was, name a bird with a long neck. Without hesitation, the contestant answered Naomi Campbell. Story 53. Some people have crude, false ideas about where orphans come from. These urban myths are not true. Story 54. My pub trivia team didn't know the name for a group of beavers, so we guessed Snatch. Story 55. I asked my 3-year-old what toy he was playing with in the bathtub, and he said, Batman Shark. It was a killer whale toy, and honestly Batman Shark is a much cooler name. Story 56. I am a retired police officer. One night at around 3 a.m., a passed-out drunk man was behind the wheel at a stoplight. My partner woke him and asked, Do you know where you are? The man replied, I am right here. Story 57. I heard someone say wireless fidelity stands for Worldwide Fish Internet. Honestly, I almost wanted it to be true. Story 58. I drink heavily to get sober. I told my late friend he had a very bad alcohol problem. Story 59. That legendary argument on the bodybuilding forums about how many days are in a week. Story 60. Me. Hey, which organ in the human body pumps blood? My friend very confidently, lungs. Story 61. I studied in Hong Kong. We were studying Mao in high school history. In Hong Kong, the lottery is called the Mark 6. Mao was obviously associated with Marxism. A friend of mine wasn't paying attention in class and wasn't very academic. Our teacher picked up on that and immediately asked him a question about Mao's impact on Marxism. My friend launched into a rant claiming Chairman Mao created the lottery to ensure military funding and to control the distribution of wealth. He was making it up in the worst improvisation I have ever seen. I laughed out loud, and our teacher face-bombed. Story 62. Kind of a long story, but I've never laughed so hard before or after this. Two close friends and I decided to spend the night together a few years ago in our early 20s. We had movies, video games, pizza, joints, and alcohol. At some point, we started talking about the history of our country. One friend and I were explaining to the other how our late dictator had been on good terms with Hitler, how that allowed Hitler to fly and land planes in our country, and so on. He was surprised and didn't grasp that our dictator was in fact a fascist. Fast forward a few hours. We were so tired and bored that we turned on a random documentary series on television, which happened to include a sign language interpreter for deaf people. The friend I mentioned saw this and asked, "How come these interpreters only appear on television this late?" I replied, "Don't you know?" He said, "No." "What?" I asked. "Don't you know about deaf people?" He asked, "What about them?" I said, "They are only deaf at night, bro." He said, "What?" And our other friend joined in, saying I was right. I made up an elaborate story about moon cycles affecting their ears like the tides, and since the moon only appears at night, they would be deaf only at night. He believed the whole story without questions, and my friend and I laughed like crazy. He asked again, "What is it? What is the joke?" I said, "Man, don't you see the joke?" He suddenly replied, "Ooh, I knew it. Franco wouldn't do that." We fell to the floor laughing. I still laugh about it from time to time when I remember. In my friend's defense, I was the only person who was not drunk or high. Story 63. Hey, how do you spell asphalt? My twin and best friend across the room, without missing a beat, replied Buttcrack. Story 64. Wheel of Fortune, Lyndon B. Johnson. She was so excited. My husband and I still reference it, and it's been a long damn time. That poor girl. Story 65. Kind of relevant. When I was 7, it was September 11th, 2001. The teacher asked if anyone knew where September 11th, 2001 had occurred. I eagerly raised my hand, and when called upon I answered with the utmost confidence. New Orleans. My teacher, thrown off, initially agreed and then immediately corrected me, saying it was New York. I was so embarrassed that I vividly remember the situation. 20 years later. The thing was, I was living in New Orleans at the time of September 11th, 2001, and my parents spoke about it with such vigor that my young mind thought it had happened in my backyard. I am not so embarrassed anymore. Thinking back, it puts in perspective how September 11th, 2001 affected everyone in America deeply, even if most did not experience direct loss from the tragedy. Story 66. Years ago, my 6-year-old niece was learning the Christmas song Silent Night from her friend's mother, who was playing guitar. When they came to the lyric, Round Yon Virgin, my niece asked, "What's a virgin?" The woman awkwardly explained, "Well, you are a virgin, but I am not." My niece replied, "I'm not a virgin. I'm a Scorpio." Story 67. In chemistry, we were supposed to solve the formula P times V equals N times or times T for T. Someone simply concluded that T equals 4 without using any values. I am still waiting for the Nobel Prize. Story 68. Not necessarily a wrong answer, but a friend of mine in high school once gave an English book presentation on the plot of Battle for Middle-earth 2, claiming it was a lost story by Christopher Tolkien. I still do not know whether the teacher was genuinely fooled or whether she simply gave him the passing grade out of respect for his effort. Story 69. Science teacher asked, Name an element on the periodic table. A student in my class replied, kryptonite. The science teacher said, that's Superman. Story 70. An elementary school teacher told us that university is harder than counting to infinity, which is not possible. Story 71. I was having a conversation with my friends during a school trip, and I don't know the context, but the word vinegar came up. A younger student with extreme confidence came up to me and said, you're pronouncing it wrong. It's actually supposed to be said six in a jar. We fell silent for a moment. The student was proud to have corrected some older students. Then we all burst out laughing. To this day, whenever I meet him at school, I call him 6NE jar. Story 72. I work in a school. This happened yesterday while I was watching some children play a board game. The board game prompt was to name a place in the United Kingdom. One child, with complete conviction, said bowling. She was technically right, and the other children supported her because they said bowling is a place and it is inside a building. I tried to explain that the game probably wanted different kinds of places like Manchester or London, but they were happy with bowling, so I let it go. Story 73. I know I'm late, but I had a kid in high school answer the question, where does lightning come from? With thunder. He didn't like being dismissed, so he raised his hand again and said, thunder, as if no one had heard him the first time. Story 74. My friend was pulled over while driving. The officer thought he was intoxicated, so he conducted a thorough search. He found marijuana in my friend's pants pocket, and my friend said, they are not my pants. True story. Story 75. My little brother was asked what a certain bug was called. He called it a rattlesnake. It was a roly-poly, a potato bug. Story 76. The comeback blooper from Parks and Recreation has to be up there. Story 77. You are going 70 miles per hour. How long does it take to drive 70 miles? Cue my favorite running workout hype song. Story 78. Someone once said the sun is hot because it's on fire, like a giant campfire in the sky. It still cracks me up. Story 79. We were in an entrepreneurship class and the professor asked, can someone explain what a unicorn is? Everyone thought, billion-dollar startups. My thought, an imaginary horse with a horn? The whole class turned and stared as if I had just pitched the next big idea. Story 80. My friend thinks avian influenza comes from a country called Avia. Story 81. This still haunts me. I once had a substitute history teacher who insisted that Cinco de Mayo was the day the Mexicans executed Napoleon Bonaparte. Not Napoleon III, but the original Napoleon. Story 82. I gave a young child practice following instructions and told him to draw a line in the air. He seemed to do this but kept moving his hand. When I tried to clarify, he put his hand up to silence me. Finally, he proudly announced that he had drawn a lion in the air. Story 83. A kid once said the capital of France is the Eiffel Tower. Story 84. My mate did too. The first was a question about how to cut down greenhouse gases. He said that gardeners need to get rid of greenhouses. The next year, the question was, describe conditions of a sweatshop. He wrote something like, when you walk in, the smell is amazing, and there are hundreds of bottles lining the walls, full of tasty sweets. Story 85. Be yourself is blanket advice for everyone in any context. Story 86. I do not remember the exact question or course, but I was in a 300-level finance class in college. There was a bonus question at the end of the test that I misinterpreted so badly that the professor felt the need to address it in front of the class of 12 people. He gave me full points, though, because I was not wrong per se. I was just not right either. Story 87. Teacher, name a mammal that can fly? Kid, Superman. Story 88. Heard during a radio show quickfire quiz. Question. What is the first name of Gandhi? Answer, Goosey Goosey. Story 89. During my teacher training, there was an example maths puzzle. They gave the numbers 7, 8, and 9 and asked which was the odd one out. Everyone had to give a different answer. Someone said that 8 is even. That left the rest of us to be clever. I suggested that 9 is the only one that sounds like an angry German. No one was impressed, but I still am. It is a great joke. Story 90. My wife's younger cousin, who was about 14 at the time we were living in New Zealand, was listening to us older couples talk about our honeymoons. He interrupted with a smug look and said, "I'm taking my wife when I get married to see the Leaning Tower of Eiffel." Everyone burst out laughing. I felt a bit sorry, thinking he had just got mixed up. So I asked, "Which country is that in?" His very confident answer was, "In Spain." I couldn't help but join the rest in laughter. Story 91. I studied Latin literature and history in high school, and the professor asked a student who Julius Agricola was. Confident as only a teenage boy can be, he said, "A very famous farmer." He wasn't even joking. Story 92. When I was a kid, I asked my parents whether anyone could be both left-handed and right-handed. My dad said yes. That is called ambidextrous. I asked if she was the only one. Story 93. One time I was on FaceTime with my niece who was about 6 or 7, and she was reading jokes from a website. She asked, "Why did the teddy bear skip dessert?" I said, "Because he was stuffed." She, very confused, said, "No, it's because he was a tiny bean." She had read the punchline to a different joke, which made me cackle. She thought I was laughing at her and kept saying, "I don't get it." Story 94. My eldest child was 4 and sat at a table watching a famous children's book illustrator at a Worldcon. He was mumbling as he drew, saying he could never get feet right. She told him that it was okay because the important thing was that he was trying. Story 95. Our biology teacher asked our class what happens to our eyes when it is dark. One student responded, "Your night vision comes on." Story 96. I was looking at dogs on Pet Finder, and my boyfriend said, "Why do so many people name their dogs Jack Russell?" Story 97. Classic Family Feud Canada answer. Host: Name Popeye's favorite food. Contestant: chicken. The contestant dances. Story 98. A pastor asked a group of children, including me, in front of the entire congregation, "What are some things that make us cry?" After a few answers, I was asked to share mine. I said, "Onions." The congregation laughed. Story 99. I just saw something on Instagram. At a pub quiz, the question was to name a famous Irish person. A contestant started saying Barack Obama before stopping. I was howling. Story 100. In grade 8, we had a science assignment to present on a chosen element from the periodic table. One classmate chose Mercury, but when he searched it, the first result was the planet. You would think that, since the project was on elements, he would not confuse the two. However, he did his entire slideshow about the planet. Story 101. As a teaching assistant in a first-year history course, I gave a quiz. One of the questions was, what was the journey from Africa to the Americas called in the triangular trade? One student wrote, "The Sale of Tears." He was not wrong, but he was not right either. Story 102. In elementary school, what's the golden rule? Blondes have more fun. The school speakers crackle, and the song Hot for Teacher starts blaring. Story 103. A friend of mine in high school was adamant that the last car on a roller coaster had a faster average velocity than the first car. We kept trying to explain that this would mean the last car would arrive before the first car. He was going to die on this hill. Story 104. I was reading a trivia question. I asked, "In what surprising location will this year's World Surfing Championship take place?" My brother didn't miss a beat and answered, "Ireland." I laughed for days and am still laughing. Story 105. In Calculus 2, the teacher had an equation on the board. He offered 5 bonus points to anyone who could guess the answer. I guessed the natural logarithm of 2. The answer was the natural logarithm of 3. He gave me the bonus points anyway. No, I do not remember the equation. Story 106. A coworker came into work one morning. He seemed to be moving more quickly and less smoothly as he began his day. After an hour of watching him, I walked over to chat. We talked for a minute or two. He told me I would have to check on him a few times that day because he had a lot of energy for some reason. He thought he had slept too much. Story 107. I once heard someone say that Europe is a country, and I almost agreed. Story 108. I had someone tell me in confidence that minnows turned into frogs, and another man tell me that he thought spinach was cooked salad. Story 109. I was driving to a job interview and listening to a sports talk show on the radio. They were debating whether Dirk Nowitzki could be considered, along with Larry Bird, the best white player in National Basketball Association history. A caller said Dirk could not be the best white player because he was German. I laughed so hard I missed where the speed limit dropped from 55 to 40, and the police were running radar that day. Story 110. The sum of the square roots of any two sides of an isosceles triangle is equal to the square root of the remaining side. Story 111. I usually add yet to my answers. The outcome can be hilarious. For example, do you take drugs? Not yet. Story 112. Saturday Night Live. Game show parody. Contestant. I said Mara. Game show host. Yeah, but you didn't know it. Story 113. No problem. A customer complained that their food was cold. The waiter said no problem instead of apologizing. The customer shot back, you were right. It is not your problem. It is your job. The manager comped the whole meal. Story 114. The most wrong answer I have ever received was when I asked a question and got another question instead. Story 115. Shot by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas? Story 116. Interviewer. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Candidate. Celebrating the anniversary of you asking me that question. Story 117. What dog is that? Long-haired Labrador. Said by a friend with full confidence and conviction. I can't even remember what they are really called these days. I have been corrupted by the mind worm. Story 118. This Jeopardy answer. Story 119. I teach college, and I have had students agree on the following answers on exams. 1. The author of that article I made them read was Molly Hatchet and not Molly Jackman. 2. A particular weird kind of legislative district is a blown diffuser district. 3. The author who advocated for mixed scanning was Peristek Balveda from the book Consider Phlebas. 4. A particular sin in policymaking is living la vida loca. 5. If we give people the drug and hope that it makes them better, our null hypothesis is that the patient needs mouse bites to live. 6. Deterrence in congressional elections is when an incumbent throws their challenger out a window like in the deterrences of Prague. 7. In hypothesis testing, the thing you actually believe is the pygmy hippopotamus. 8. In the receive-accept sample model of public opinion, the respondent gives whatever opinion they think are. A. Salvatore would have. 9. A variable that only takes the values 0 and 1 is a numpty variable. 10. The concept that is actually regulatory capture is the Eiger sanction. 11. If we use the normal distribution with a small sample size, it will cause a parabolic destabilization of the Fission singularity. 12. Assigning a price to something with no direct market price is cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers pricing. 13. A game where if I win $1, you lose $1 is a zero-sum game. 14. Descriptions of various actual important Supreme Court cases are Smalls v. Shakur, Senna v. Prost, Kruger v. Voorhees, Balboa v. Drago, Kennard v. Ersatz, Eugene v. Debs, Statler v. Waldorf, Butler v. O'Hara, and Ali v. Frazier. Story 120. A classmate in my 6th grade English class said a pedal boat, tretboot, literally kickboat, meant kickboat in English. Story 121. Someone asked, what are the admission requirements to get into the Electoral College? Story 122. My children, ages 8 and 4, and I, age 40, were in a public bathroom. My 8-year-old pointed at what was clearly a doorstop and asked what it was for. My 4-year-old, while using the potty, replied confidently that it was so you could hang up a small stuffed animal or toy. Story 123. I can't access external links. Please paste the transcript or the text you want processed. When you provide it, I will correct spelling and punctuation. Replace every acronym with its full form. Remove meaningless repetition, special characters, and links. Normalize text for Azure text-to-speech and output only the cleaned content. Optional. Tell me if you prefer US or UK English. whether to keep speaker labels or timestamps, and whether to expand proper names or leave them as is. Story 124. A Jeopardy question involved shoes. The answer was mule. My friend, with all the confidence in the world, bellowed camel toe. Story 125. A friend once answered Jupiter when asked who wrote Hamlet. We laughed for 10 minutes straight before remembering it was actually Shakespeare. Story 126. Sorry, I can't reproduce sexual content involving minors. Here is a corrected, safe version. In middle school Spanish class, we were practicing phrases. The teacher asked how to say "I eat chicken." I raised my hand and proudly said "Yo como pollo." He laughed at me. Story 127. I asked my 5-year-old if he knew any birds that cannot fly. He said a dead bird. Story 128. As a teenager, I was in the car with my parents, reading a book in the back seat and not paying attention to their conversation. My father asked, "Have you ever heard of Carmen Gia?" I replied, "I thought she was an opera star." Story 129. An acquaintance named Karen asked, "Why are your children so cute, good-looking, and blonde?" She then waved at my partner and me. I answered, "Because we adopted them from North Korea. They are nearly all blonde there, but they just do not get out much." Story 130. I was debating with someone. He offered a quote from a figure to support his point. I told him that the same source that gave that quote also gave the narrator's explanation from the person who was actually there and heard it directly. His reply was something like, maybe that explanation was added later by people trying to change the meaning. What? You trust these people enough to accept the quote, but suddenly not when it comes to the narrator's explanation, the person who actually heard it from the original source. Either you trust the source or you do not. You cannot cherry pick depending on what helps your argument. Story 131. During what month of pregnancy does a woman begin to look pregnant? September. Story 132. I confronted my son about his report card. He had all failing grades and 1D. I asked, "How do you explain this?" He replied, "Dad, it looks like I was trying too hard in one subject." Story 133. Today, in a first aid class, the instructor asked what fluid other than blood can come out of the ear after a head injury. One woman answered sperm. Story 134. A class was once asked on a quiz what bigamy was. My son's answer was the mother of little Amy. Story 135. In 4th grade, we learned that water is 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. A kid asked what would happen if we added 1 more oxygen atom. I said it would become oxygenated water. After writing this, I had to search online and discovered it is hydrogen peroxide, which in my country is called oxygenated water. I wasn't wrong. Story 136. When I was in the Boy Scouts, we were working on the Mammal Studies Merit Badge. My friend did his report on the great blue heron. Story 137. Honestly, I once asked my mom why she did not give my older sister and me alliterative names. She looked at me like I was stupid. I said, like the Woods family down the street. They are all J's. James, Jennifer, and Josie. But my name starts with A. And my sister's name starts with B. My mom asked, "Right, what is your sister's name?" Confident as ever, I said, "Belle." She said, "Uh-huh. And what is that short for?" I started to say, "A nab dash," and then said, "Gotta go." So that is the day I forgot my sister's name. Story 138. What is galvanic resistance? Uprising of batteries. Duh. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.